Our motto of big enough to count and small enough to care is our driving force.
I want to be known as the best bank to do business with in the state of Colorado. You can only do it with great people, with collaboration, with keeping your clients' needs in mind, and that's where we want to be and who we are.
One of our greatest values of having local decision-making culture, besides speed to market and things like that, it's certainty of execution. When we tell a customer we're going to do something, we deliver on it.
Whether they need a $1 million line of credit, a home equity loan, treasury management, we're here to serve the entire business banking and middle market community.
And it's really operating customers that have the need to make their working capital management cycle efficient. We give them the tools to achieve that.
Because we've got everyone at the table, we can make creative solutions for them.
It's not just about the product and service, it's about what else we can do for you.
I've had a lot of clients over the years say, we couldn't have done it without you guys. And that's the reward for doing business the right way.
If we can build that sense of trust, that sense of consistency, that sense of accountability, that's where we think our competitive advantage is.
Good morning, and welcome to Vectra Bank's 29th Annual Economic Forecast. As we navigate these unusual times, we appreciate your virtual attendance, and thank you for your support as we continue this important tradition online. Our sincere hope is that next year we will once again be able to host this event in person. I'm Bruce Alexander, President and CEO of Vectra Bank, Colorado, and I am presenting to you this morning from the Sewell Ballroom at the Denver Center for the Performing Arts. Next year will mark the 30th anniversary of this event, and I'm looking forward to buying you all breakfast and meeting again in person. This morning we have gathered to look back on the year that has been and also to look forward to the year ahead. We will review key market trends, market signals, and our presenters will do their best to look into the crystal ball of economics and predict what's next. In a year that for many of us seemed like Groundhog's Day, we watched with anticipation as to how the market would respond to the Delta and Omicron variants of COVID-19, the impact of continued vaccinations and efforts for health and safety, wildfires both within our own backyard and throughout the country, and debate in the political environment regarding tax and economic policy change. What result will the challenge of labor shortages, wage pressure, supply chain issues, and a housing market where demand continues to exceed supply have on the economy in the year ahead? The questions today are ever-changing, and how we respond will certainly direct and impact the road ahead. Our speakers today will share their insights for 2022 and review the economic assessment of this past year. We will address the status of the economy at both the state and the national level. We've left time at the end of our program to give you access to these experts. At any time, you can submit your questions by clicking on the blue button on your home screen or simply using the chat feature below. Today's first speaker is Patty Silverstein, one of our longtime guests. Patty is the president of Development Research Partners and currently serves as a consulting chief economist for the Metro Denver Economic Development Corporation and the Denver Metro Chamber of Commerce. Vectra Bank is a proud member of the Metro Denver Economic Development Corporation. One of the valuable resources that the EDC provides its investors is regular access to customized research and economic data. Much of that data is refined and shared annually by Patty. And we are so delighted that she can join us today. Please help me welcome Patty Silverstein.
Thanks so much, Bruce. Hey everybody, I am delighted to be back here once again to talk about this whole crazy year that we have experienced. So have any of you ever had an electronics device that didn't quite work? So what do you do when it's not quite functioning properly? You restart, you reset, you refresh. That's what I'm hoping we can do this year with our economy. We have had so many supply-demand imbalances that it really is time to reset, restart. And indeed, when you think about this past year and perhaps where we are headed now into 2022, there's a lot of words that start with RE that describe our experience of this past year. And we'll talk about that as we go through. So, first things first, I know that Marci is going to be covering the whole national outlook, but just so that I can set the baseline for where I am starting from. Real GDP, that's our broadest measure of economic activity, increased by 5.7% in 2021. It was a very strong increase, but we know it was a lot of up and down all throughout the year in terms of getting there to that 5.7%. Our expectation in 2022 is that we will still have a strong U.S. growth year, but we'll see that pull back to about a 4.1% growth rate. So still growing, but at a slightly slower pace as we start to reset, as we start to get back to some of our historic norms, truly. So I'm going to be talking about labor force and employment, what we've seen happening there, how that feeds into our commercial real estate markets throughout Colorado. Then we'll go into our demographics and our consumer spending activity, and we'll wrap it up with residential real estate. But so first of all, in labor force and employment, we've called this, or some folks have called this, the great resignation or the great renegotiation. I mean, we certainly realize that there's a lot of RE words here that describe our labor force. We have retirements. We have people that are working remotely. We have people that are reevaluating their whole life, their whole career path. And that is certainly influencing a lot of our employment growth and our availability. So good news is that Colorado, we are now ranked 13th in terms of employment recovery. So we have recovered at this point in time about 89% of the job losses that we experienced due to the COVID recession. And as a reminder, maybe we don't even want this reminder, but as a reminder, those job losses had indeed been severe. 376,000 jobs in Colorado that were basically wiped away, it felt like overnight, actually occurred over a 3-month period. As I say, now we have added back about 89% of those jobs in Colorado. In the Metro Denver region, where I'm standing right now, 91.4% of the jobs have been recovered. So both in Metro Denver and Colorado, we are experiencing employment growth rates faster than the nation. We've recovered more of the jobs than the nation. The national recovery rate is about 84% right now. Our expectation, if we continue on some of these same growth trends, is that we will recover all of those jobs that had been lost here in Colorado by about the fourth quarter of this year. It's a slow process. Even though we lost those jobs virtually overnight, it takes a while to add them all back. Incidentally, there are 4 states that have actually surpassed and have recovered all of those jobs that were lost. Are some of our key competitor states: Utah, Idaho, Texas, Arizona. All of those areas have now added back all of their jobs that had been lost. Our recovery varies significantly all across the state. So we take a look at our 7 metropolitan statistical areas across the state. These are basically our urbanized areas of the state. They cover 17 of our 64 counties here throughout Colorado. The area where we're seeing the fastest growth right now is the Colorado Springs region. So that's El Paso County and Teller County combined. That Colorado Springs MSA, they have really diversified their economic base. So they're seeing broad-based job growth. Oftentimes I've said that, it's the military influence in Colorado Springs that is influencing their growth patterns, but it really now is much more of a diversified pattern. And also there's a category called transportation transportation, warehousing, and utilities. And I'm going to be referring to this one quite a bit here. But that warehousing component is a lot of our logistics operations, our e-commerce operations, and that has been growing very rapidly in Colorado Springs. The Metro Denver region is coming in second, our growth rate of about 3.3%. We also have a very diversified economic base. We have been driven by a lot of the high-tech companies. Those high-tech businesses continue to add employees, so we see significant growth from that. Our manufacturing base has been pretty stable, and that's really good news for us because that's businesses like aerospace, like bioscience, like our food and beverage companies. So that's providing some good stability, and also that whole transportation, warehousing, and utilities, all of the logistics operations have been huge here in Metro Denver. Then we get to Fort Collins and Boulder, and I'm going to kind of combine those, both of those areas being university towns, and they were a little slower to start to see their growth just because if you didn't have the students there on campus, if you didn't have them spending money in the community, they really saw it lagging throughout their whole economic system. Now they're getting back on much firmer ground. Those students are back. They're out there spending their dollars, and that's carrying that forward. In the Grand Junction marketplace, they have been an area that has remain pretty resilient there because of outdoor recreation. We all wanted to get outside and get out there and enjoy the environment. So that has helped to boost Grand Junction as well as a lot of retirees. Their housing prices significantly lower than many other parts of the state, so that's very attractive for many of the retirees. In the Greeley market, they're kind of lagging behind a bit in versus their normal growth patterns. And this has been a challenge for them because of natural resources, so the oil and gas type of employment, as well as these days on the renewable energy side. And this is really what is causing a lot of challenge up there, because usually if oil and gas wasn't doing very well, renewable was doing better, and you had this kind of balancing act. And now both of them have been a bit challenged. Pueblo continues to be the slowest growth metropolitan statistical area in the state of Colorado, as is pretty normal for them. Again, very much influenced by the steel industry. And there's some good news that is actually going to be happening in the steel industry, with some of their key employers actually expecting to expand some of their operations here in the next year or so. Elsewhere throughout Colorado, if you look every place else, all of those 47 other counties throughout the state, we see a growth rate of about 2.2%, so a little bit slower than what we're seeing throughout Colorado as a whole. More the mountain resort region is where we're tending to see more of that concentration of growth, just as we see a return to some of the tourism activity here in Colorado. Looking at our employment by supersector, remember that all companies that operate out there are put into one of these buckets according to the type of good, the type of service that they provide. Professional and business services is our largest industry supersector, we call them. And it is such good news that we've actually seen an expansion of professional and business services compared to where we had been in 2019. So in this chart, I'm looking at 2019 there in green, the gray is 2020, 2021 in yellow, and really the relevant comparison is how are we doing? How did we do in 2021 compared to 2019? We'll just kind of forget that 2020 even existed there. But so we want to compare, are we back onto that normal growth trend that we're hoping for within our region? And we see that the two sectors here in Colorado have indeed expanded at this point beyond where they had been in 2019. That professional and business services, that's everything from your legal and accounting services all the way through computer systems design. So that's where we find a lot of our high-tech companies. This serves as a very solid foundation for our growth. So if this industry is growing and expanding, again, our foundation is very solid. The other industry is a third from the bottom there on that chart. Transportation, warehousing, and utilities again. That is the one that we have a higher employment base now than what we had in 2019, again, because of all of the logistics operations, the warehousing operations. Two of them were relatively flat, financial activities as well as wholesale and retail trade. Now, our expectation as we move into 2022 is that we will start to see more of these hitting that positive pattern compared to 2019. One of the areas that is indeed still lagging is what we call leisure and hospitality, kind of towards the middle of that slide there. Leisure and hospitality, that's all of our hotels, our accommodations, it's our restaurants, it's our entertainment venues that we miss so much. And indeed, until we really get back out there in a normal, quote unquote, pattern, that is an industry that is going to continue to lag. So put all that together, our expectation is that our employment growth rate will indeed continue into 2022. Albeit at a slightly slower pace than what we did experience during 2021. And by this, though, notice for the state of Colorado, we basically expect 78,000 jobs were added in 2021. We'll see about that same level that will be added in 2022. In the Metro Denver marketplace, because Metro Denver represents 60 to 62% of our employment throughout the state, we'll see that the number of jobs added will slide just a little bit from about 52,000 down to 49,000 in 2022. So there's been a lot of discussion about where are all the workers. Indeed, as we start taking a look out into 2022 and figuring out what that employment growth pattern can be, one of the challenges is that companies are not necessarily able to find the workers that they want to employ. So potentially our employment would be higher if we indeed were seeing more of these workers available. Focus on that purple line, which is the number of unemployed here in the state of Colorado, versus the green line, which is the number of job openings. You will see that the number of job openings that we have is greater than the number of unemployed people that we have here in Colorado, to the tune of about 48,000 people. So certainly, it's challenging out there. I don't know what else to say. It's challenging out there to find the workers that you want. Put on top of this a high level of quits. People are voluntarily leaving their position currently. The last time that we had such a level of quits activity was back in late 2015, early 2016. That was one of the fastest employment growth periods coming out of the whole Great Recession. So this actually, as difficult as it is that all of these folks are quitting, it makes absolute sense that this is happening. If you're looking around you and you're seeing greater job opportunities, if you're looking at reevaluating your life there, you're looking at opportunities that will pay you more money, provide you more amenities, give you more flexibility. Maybe it's that ability to remote work for several more days a week or some such thing. It makes sense that people are reevaluating right now. When they quit, it doesn't mean that they're taking off and just exploring the mountains all day long. They are indeed quitting, remaining in the labor force, seeking new positions. The other thing to note, that other separations, that's the yellow line, those other separations reflect then all the retirements, deaths, disabilities. We've certainly seen that number go up, as well as many people have said during this whole COVID issue, their pandemic epiphany, that no, it's time to retire. I'm going to move on. So we have seen a little higher level there. So despite this fact that we have this great number of openings, the openings greater than unemployment, we still have a relatively higher unemployment rate here in the state of Colorado. Our unemployment rate of 4.8% surpasses that of the nation of 3.9%. Indeed, we have currently the 15th highest unemployment rate in the country. What also, though, bodes well is that we have a high labor force participation rate, so we do expect that we will start to see people really moving back into the labor force. The other component of this that I want to point out, that, when I talk about employment growth and what bucket you are in terms of super sector, that does not include our sole proprietors, those folks that are self-employed, those entrepreneurs, those innovators. Colorado, if we took all of our self-employed plus all of our wage and salary employment, Added it all together, we'd see about 25.6% of our employment base is due to this sole proprietor employment out there. This is not necessarily number of individuals, this is a number of positions, because you can have one person holding more than one gig job out there. We saw this number come back down a little bit into 2019, 2020. There's been a lot of discussion that in 2021, in 2021, people were taking a lot of those federal relief funds, starting their own business. So it'll be interesting to see those 2021 numbers when we can actually get that data. But one of the things that has been perhaps a little bit disturbing, giving us kind of some cause for pause, we do a report called Toward a More Competitive Colorado for the Metro Denver Economic Development Corporation. We take a look at 30 key indicators, compare how we're doing all across the country with more of a specific focus on 9 of our key competitor states. This year's report, we saw that 14 of those 30 indicators, Colorado remained in the top 10. Very solid foundation. But one area, one category that we're starting to see slip a little bit was in terms of our entrepreneurship, our innovation. We looked at this, the Kauffman Early Stage Entrepreneurship Index is one of those key indicators that we track. And notice the index is there on your left side of the screen. On the right side is actually how we rank compared with the other states. We have gone from number 3 in this index to the most recent data at number 22. There are 4 components of this index that are equally weighted in their calculations. This rate of new entrepreneurs, the opportunity share of new entrepreneurs is one I want to highlight, because that's the number of folks that started their business because they wanted to, not because they had to. Okay? This opportunity share of entrepreneurs, we have seen our rank, we've seen that percentage go down recently. The other component that is perhaps a little bit concerning is our startup early survival rate. What percentage of our companies actually after a year are still functioning well? We're seeing that percentage has been going down. Our rank in that particular component has been sliding as well. So this all points to the importance then of our financial institutions, our small business development centers, really providing the assistance, the guidance for these entrepreneurs so that they can build their business, keep that business growing, and perhaps at some point adding employees to that business. So how has all this influenced our commercial real estate market? Well, companies are now having to reinvent, reevaluate how they use that physical space. They've been renovating their space, redeveloping their space to make sure that they can accommodate the types of changes that have been going on within the marketplace. Now, I know that many of you are from all throughout Colorado. I'm going to focus on just Metro Denver data here just because there's really no great statewide source of commercial real estate data. But hopefully the trends will kind of ring true with what you are experiencing, but we know that all real estate is definitely local to your own communities. In the office market, one of the key trends has been, of course, this whole shift to remote work is still continuing, so companies are still really trying to figure out when they're going to be bringing people back into the office. It had originally been around Labor Day, then it was going to be the first of the year, and now some of those returns to office have certainly been kind of up in the air. And so the office market has been rather suffering in terms of that. On the industrial side, again, I'm going to sound like a broken record here, but going back to all of the warehousing, the logistics operations have made our whole industrial market absolutely thrive. We have built 5 million square feet or more in the Metro Denver marketplace each year of the past 5 years. And we're going to top that off. By 2022, we're going to complete nearly 11 million square feet of space. This is huge. This is mind-blowing within our region here. But what's happening is many of these companies, many of our logistics companies, they want to make sure that they are close to their customer base so that you can get whatever item you had ordered overnight. So they have to bring everything close to the customers. And these logistics operations need high ceilings. They need lots of power for all the robotics that are being employed within their warehouses. So a lot of the older industrial space that we had in the Metro Denver market is obsolete. And so we're really having to develop a lot of this. This is going to open up, I believe, new redevelopment opportunities in the industrial market in the years ahead. Retail has been surprisingly stable. Yes, we consumers have been out there purchasing dollars, using our purchasing goods with our dollars, and it's been relatively stable. Add all that together, in 2022, we are forecasted to add 13 million square feet in the Metro Denver marketplace in that single year. That is a record year for us. Again, the bulk of that coming through the whole industrial market. Let's turn now to our demographics, who lives here, and how we spend our dollars. In this marketplace right now, we've been looking at replacements. We as consumers, we've been replacing everything in our house. We've been repurchasing items. We have been reinvesting in our homes. We have been adding to those renovations, all sorts of ways that we can spend our money here in the region. So here in Colorado, we are nearly 6 million people strong, but we have just come through one of the slowest paces of growth that we have had since going back to about 1990, I suppose. In Colorado, we saw the green bars along the bottom. That's our natural increase in the population. That's births, less deaths. We have had more deaths. We have had very limited new births. So our natural increase in the population is at a very low level right now. Net migration, we were also seeing, as much as people talked about, they need to move out of highly urbanized areas more into rural communities. That wasn't necessarily hitting us as much here in Colorado as perhaps a New York or Los Angeles type of area. So we saw lower net migration here into the state as well. So that we only added about 48,000 net new people here in Colorado in 2021 versus our kind of historic average is going to be more along the lines of about 72,000. If we take a look from 2019 to 2021, again, the state posted one of the slower population growth rates. Notice that 26 counties actually lost population over this 2-year period. Those are the counties that are in some shade of blue or the very light shade of yellow. 26 of our 64 counties lost population. Much of the population growth has been focused along the Front Range of Colorado. Notice Weld County, Douglas County, Broomfield are all areas where we have seen very strong population growth rates. Well, all of us consumers here, as I had mentioned, we got out there, we spent dollars. Just about every category of retail spending here in Colorado, we saw that our spending levels in 2021 surpassed that of 2019. There's one category there, food services and drinking places, that it's just barely above. That's our bars and restaurants, just barely above prior spending, but we have surpassed that. I also want to point out this non-store retailers. That's the economist geek speak for all the e-commerce activities. We saw a near doubling or an over doubling of that expenditure pattern in 2021 and continued to see strong growth in that in 2021 compared to 2020, and expect that to continue into 2022. Add all that together, the growth rates are astounding in the retail sector right now. The U.S. level increasing near 20% 5% over what it had been in 2020. Here in the state of Colorado, we're looking at over a 17% increase. Now, we expect we're going to see some pullback in that activity. We expect that we're going to see some resetting to some of our historic growth patterns, such that our retail spending growth will come back down into more of the neighborhood of a 5% increase in 2022 compared to where it had been in 2021. Finally, then, our residential real estate sector. Wow, has it been just this crazy, incredible year in residential real estate here within our area. But we're also looking at needing to rebuild many of the homes that have been destroyed in wildfires and other natural disasters throughout the state. We are looking at replacing some of our older homes. We're reconstructing, we're renovating, we're rehabilitating our homes. We have been investing a lot of dollars into our residential marketplace and recognizing that, boy, our home prices vary significantly all throughout the state. You have somewhere like Eagle County where the median home price, is $1.5 million. The green bars there reflect basically our mountain resort communities there. That's where we have tended to see the highest rates of home appreciation. We have seen appreciation rates within that area of 30% or so. It's amazing the level of prices there. Versus look at the blue bars. That's our western slope. That's where you tend to see some very affordable homes. We're looking at homes in the $300,000 to $350,000 range, tending to see, though, in this past year that the appreciation rates have still been in the 15 to 20% range. The purple bars, that's Metro Denver. That's where we tend to see the highest prices outside of our mountain resort regions, and that's where we've been seeing appreciation rates in the 18% range or better. Though our southeastern part of the state, showing up there in red, also you tend to get some more affordability, perhaps some lower appreciation rates. And then right there in the middle of the chart, our northern Colorado area, again, tending to see a little bit more affordability and indeed a little more moderation in the home prices that we have seen. But this is still a very disturbing trend all across the state of Colorado because our home prices have been increasing at a much faster pace than consumer prices as a whole or as our wages. And indeed, if you look at this chart, the red line, the gray line, our wages tend to track fairly closely with the consumer price index over time, those increases in wages. Sometimes it takes a little bit to catch up or whatever, but they tend to track very closely together. The green line is our housing price, and we have been through a very sustained period where our home prices have been increasing at a much faster pace than our income levels. But there's some hope out there. We are building a lot. Oh my goodness. In the state of Colorado, we had a near 50% increase in the number of building permits that have been issued in 2021. So that bodes well for the new units that will be completed. Just the permit was issued in 2021. They may not actually be completed until 2022, 2023. Nonetheless, this whole increase in our housing stock bodes well for trying to bring some of this whole supply but demand imbalance that we are experiencing in our residential marketplace, trying to see a little more moderation, trying to bring this again back to a point, resetting it to where we need to be to really see our economy be able to thrive. With that, I look forward to answering any questions that you may have about what we have been experiencing. In the meantime there, make it a great 2022. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Patty. As always, your insights into our economy and what's happening within the state of Colorado are so important in understanding where we are today and what lies ahead. We are now very pleased to welcome this year's Economic Forecast keynote speaker, Dr. Marci Rossell. Some of you may remember Dr. Rossell from last year. Marci is a world-renowned economist And as the former chief economist for CNBC, she speaks candidly on the nexus of economics, politics, culture, and the media. You may also recognize Marci from her role as a former co-host of the morning news and talk show Squawk Box. Dr. Rossell is well known for taking complex economic issues and making them relevant to people's lives, families, and careers. We are so excited she could join us today. Please help me welcome Dr. Marci Rossell.
Thank you so much, Bruce. It's a pleasure to be back speaking with you again. Looking forward to the year 2022, because as I sort of seek to make sense of what's likely to happen over the next 12 months to 5 years, which is sort of a traditional outlook for an economist, I see 2022 as being the year of what I'll call normalization. Now, obviously, everything in 2022 will not go back to normal. Obviously, I'm here with you virtually as opposed to being there in person. So we're not quite back to completely normal yet. But if you put this year in the context of the last 2 years, where 2020 was the year of the majority of the negative economic effects from the pandemic, where the global economy contracted significantly, bottomed out in July of that year. So a very swift contraction that led to a very rapid improvement in economic conditions in 2021. So 2020, a year of great decline. 2021, a year of a snapback in economic activity. And 2022 is a year when I see a lot of things that currently, right now, in the month of February, feel so much in an uproar. Things like inflation, things like labor market trends, things like monetary policy, things like the housing market. All of those things, I believe, are reaching some of their peak constraints right here, right now. And what we're likely to see as the year 2022 unravels and plays out before all of us, what we're likely to see is that we go back to something that looks much more normal than what we've experienced over the last 2 years. So I'm going to address first and foremost what I think is probably on everybody's mind, and that is those enormous inflation numbers that we've seen over the last 6 months. So as we wrapped up the year 2021 in December of last year, inflation rates peaked at 7%. Now, those are some of the highest inflation rates that we've seen in many, many decades. So that was a real startling development at the end of last year. But I want to break it down for you and talk about how much of that inflation is temporary, how much of that inflation is more medium term, and how much of that inflation is long term. And those long term inflation issues, I believe, are going to be related to real issues in labor markets. Because many of us, myself included, expected the labor supply in the U.S. to really come roaring back when all of that income support, the extended unemployment benefits, began to be curtailed at the end of last year. And it seemed as if instead of the labor picture getting better, it actually got worse and more difficult as the year went on. So I want to talk to you about some long-term challenges facing the labor market that really have to do with demographics and less to do with the pandemic and the cyclical behavior of the U.S. economy, which will get us to a discussion of monetary policy. Against the backdrop of rising inflation, against the backdrop of a strengthening labor market, the Federal Reserve is expected to raise rates at their next meeting in March, next month. So the question is, what does that mean for the economy? What does that mean for you? So let's start with the thing that is probably on the minds of most of you, certainly on the minds of the folks at the Federal Reserve, and that is those startling inflation numbers in the month of December that probably bled into the month of January. So in order to understand how it is that inflation can be running so high right now, you really have to understand that one of the reasons the prices have increased so dramatically is because they fell so dramatically in 2020 and in early 2021. So much of the inflation that we're seeing right now is what I'll call really temporary inflation. It's transitory. It's related to pandemic disruptions. So anytime there is an outbreak of COVID in some other parts of the world where they have a zero COVID tolerance policy, you see ports being shut down, you see factories being shut down. That can lead to short-term supply disruptions, and that can often lead to panic buying. Like we saw really in toilet paper markets in early 2020. So anytime you have a pandemic-related disruption, it tends to be very short term. It tends to lead to some panic buying. Again, we saw it in toilet paper. We saw it in lumber. And so when you see it in these sort of individual markets, it can cause a spike in inflation, but it's not the kind of inflation, that short-term inflation that really bothers policymakers and drives them to make changes in monetary policy. What's much more disconcerting than that kind of toilet paper-like inflation is the inflation that we've seen in energy markets. And so if you look at that 7% headline inflation number, the biggest components of those inflation increases were increases in the prices for oil and gas, for natural gas, for energy of all types. And so those energy market disruptions and changes that we've seen are really driving a large portion of that 7% inflation number that really startled folks at the end of last year. So I want to look a little bit deeper at energy markets because I'm of the opinion that over the course of this year, many of the stresses that we've seen in energy markets are likely to dissipate, that we're probably living through right now the worst of what we're going to see for energy markets in terms of high prices. And in order to understand them, again, you have to put them into the perspective of what happened at the beginning of the pandemic in 2020. So if you recall, back in July of 2020, about 4 months into the pandemic, oil prices actually for a short period of time were zero or even negative in some cases because global economic activity had slowed so dramatically. Factories were closed. People weren't going anywhere. They weren't driving. They weren't flying. So the demand for oil and gas literally shut off in a really short period of time. Took everybody by surprise. And so at that point, oil producers had to find a place to store their product. And so in some instances, the need for storage drove prices below zero. Well, if prices go to zero, then the people who sort of are drilling for oil have no incentive to do so. And we can see that big fall off in the rig count. So I brought a little chart here for you guys today, a little graph to show you what happened to rig counts, the number of oil rigs producing oil in the United States over the course of the last couple of years. So prior to the pandemic, you can see that in early 2020, late 2019, early 2020, the oil rig count was around 800. And as oil prices tumbled again and moved to zero during that early phase of the pandemic, the rig count in the U.S. fell to about 250. So a very rapid decline. Very quickly, producers moved to basically turn the tap off early in the pandemic. Now, one of the themes that I want you to sort of take away from my remarks today is just how difficult it is to forecast a recovery in the economy. Because the downturn took us all by such surprise, no one really saw the pandemic and just how badly it was going to affect the global economy. So no one anticipated certainly that oil prices at one point would be negative. And in the midst of all that, it was really hard to anticipate how quickly demand for not just oil and gas, but everything would come roaring back as we moved to kind of living with the pandemic, as we moved to returning to travel, as we moved to shopping again and doing all of those things. Now, the unfortunate thing, which I suspect many of you out there know, any of you who are connected to the energy industry at all, it's really quick to turn the tap off, but it takes much more time to turn it back on. So even though we have seen a recovery in the rig count, as of last week, we are still about 200 rigs short of where we were prior to the pandemic, which means the price of oil has gone from 18 months ago all the way up to a post-fracking high of over $90 a barrel. Now, what I find interesting is that executives in the majors are beginning to sort of come out and express a little bit of concern as they see production beginning to return to normal. They are coming out and saying, we're worried about prices falling dramatically. And so we're in this sort of transition period where, in terms of the effect on the consumer and the effect on inflation, oil prices have driven the train for the last few months. But the industry is starting to get a little bit concerned that high prices, in some sense, solve the problem in that you get supply. The incentive to supply in that market is so very strong that you're seeing production increase. You're seeing all these things that are happening that suggest that as the year goes on, oil prices will begin to abate, and this will feed into lower inflation numbers as the years go on. Now, certainly, the restrictions in demand, the unexpected restrictions in supply, the unexpected snapback in demand, all of this is playing out against the backdrop of geopolitical tensions between Russia and Ukraine. It's worth noting that Russia supplies 1 in 10 of every barrel of oil that gets used in the global economy every single day. And so certainly the prospect of sanctions, the prospects of any disruption to that supply to the global economy is a third factor that is supporting high oil prices right now. And because I'm not an expert in geopolitics, I'm not an expert in East-West relations, I cannot tell you how those tensions are likely to play out over the next couple of months. But certainly all those things together have brought us to a situation where I believe the price of oil is probably going to peak at below $100 a barrel and slowly make its way over time back to what I believe is actually the equilibrium price for oil in the world today. And it's between $50 and $60 a barrel. That was where we were prior to the pandemic. And eventually we will go back to that, which will be a powerful deflationary force over the course of this year. I just don't think we're quite there yet. We're probably not going to see that until we get beyond the uncertainty of the cold winter and the uncertainty that is being introduced into international markets by the tension between Russia and Ukraine. So that's kind of the short-term inflationary. But I want to talk to you about two more issues that feed into inflation that are a little more medium-term and long-term. And that has to do with the disruption to global shipping capacity that was brought on by the pandemic, as well as the medium-term issues around semiconductor supply. One of the things I want you to take away from my remarks is just how quickly demand rebounded in such an unexpected way. And it is easy to sort of cut supply, but frequently it's much more difficult to ramp it back up. And I think the example of what's happened in the shipping industry will illustrate this. So early on in the pandemic, shipping capacity worldwide was cut by about 17% as shipping companies sort of believed that the global economy would contract so dramatically that trade would contract as well. So they wouldn't need as many ships. What they didn't anticipate was that due to the tremendous government support for incomes worldwide, once the initial shock of the pandemic wore off, global shoppers basically went on a shopping spree because they couldn't spend money on services. They didn't feel safe to travel. They didn't feel safe going to restaurants. They didn't feel safe doing those sort of high-touch service sector activities. They took their money, their tremendous amount of savings. And if you heard me speak last year, I talked extensively about all of the excess savings that was sort of sloshing around the global economy because of the pandemic. People moved to remote work. And for folks who didn't lose their jobs, they were saving much more money than they ever had before. They weren't spending it on services. And so they spent it on goods instead. And so the tremendous demand for goods coming out of Asian factories from U.S. consumers meant that we had supply chain issues worldwide throughout last year because it's really easy to cut capacity, but it takes much longer to build it back up to bring more ships online, particularly if, as a shipping company, you're worried that that increase in demand might not be permanent. So as we move to more normal economic activities, where we move more and more of our spending away from hard goods and back to services, I think you'll see some of that stress on the global shipping capacity decline. But that's going to take, again, it's going to be a trend that rolls out for the entire year. And you won't see that issue being alleviated, I believe, until well into 2023. The other short, medium-term issue for inflation has to do with semiconductors. And the pandemic sort of revealed for the average American just how dependent U.S. industry and U.S. consumers are on the supply of semiconductors that is very geographically concentrated in Asia. Now, early on in the pandemic, many industries, such as the automobile industry in the U.S., cut their contracts for semiconductors, cut the contracts that they had with their suppliers, because again, they did not anticipate how quickly the economy would recover, how strong consumer demand would be for real goods as opposed to services. And so stockpiles and the traditional sort of supplying of semiconductors from Asia to the U.S., to the car industry, was disrupted in a very short period of time. And now that production has attempted to go back to normal, the supply chain is still obviously very disrupted, and it's brought calls to reshore semiconductor manufacturing to the U.S. That takes time, and it takes money. It takes years to build semiconductor capacity, and it takes billions of dollars. So we know that Intel has projects underway to build new fabrication plants in Arizona. We know that the current administration in Washington has put money and energy behind increasing the capacity to produce semiconductors in the U.S. But again, you're not going to see relief in that area really for probably about 18 months, because this has been a problem that everyone's been aware of for the last 6 months. So we're taking steps to deal with it, but it's going to be at least a year out before you start to see relief in that area. So I think semiconductors and shipping capacity worldwide are two medium-term constraints that businesses will face. They will increase the cost of doing business, and they will feed through into higher inflation than what would have been otherwise. But before I leave inflation in the medium term and talk about more long-term issues around labor supply, I want to note for you that I believe over the next few years, we're going to see some powerful deflationary forces coming from the slowdown in the Chinese economy. So the real estate sector, which is heavily indebted, particularly the real estate construction sector in China, but the entire Chinese economy is heavily indebted. And I am of the belief that they will grow old before they grow rich. So just this year, the Chinese economy experienced for the first time more deaths than births. And so all of that growth that they have enjoyed over the last 20 years, that was so much of what was driven by very, very cheap labor from an exploding population, has now reached its limit. The effects of China's one-child policy are finally starting to really hit home for them in a very meaningful way. And I believe that without that increase in population, their economy is really going to struggle to continue to grow at the 7-8% range that they would need to grow in order to become on par with U.S. economy, Europe, and Japan. Their standards of living are likely never to reach that overall. And so what I expect to see over the next few years, particularly as the demand for building materials in their real estate sector declines because of the sort of bust from the boom that they're experiencing right now, you're going to see a lot of deflationary pressure on basic building materials. Now, again, this is a long-term trend. It's not something that's going to develop next week or the next week. So if you're building a house right now and thinking that this is going to help you, it's probably not. But we do need to be aware and sort of have on your radar screen that there are significant changes for the global economy that are likely to occur over the next 5 to 10 years as the Chinese economy slows down and shifts from being an economy that grew 7-8% a year to an economy that grows more like the U.S. economy at 2 or 3% a year. And that's going to be a radical change for not only the Chinese economy, but the way that the Chinese economy interacts with the global economy. And I believe that that's going to have a powerful dampening effect on price increases once we get beyond the pandemic type disruptions that are sort of coloring everything right now when it comes to those numbers. Which gets me to the effect of labor supply, because one of the real issues, one of the sort of inflationary forces that's coming out of the U.S. economy has to do with how scarce talent has become. And so there's an idea out there that as companies have to pay higher wages, they're going to pass those higher wages on to consumers in the form of higher prices. And there will be some of that happens over the next couple of years. But I want to dig a little deeper into the scarcity of talent because, like I said earlier in my remarks, I suspect many of you, myself included, believed that once all the income support that was coming from extended unemployment benefits, the relief payments that went directly to families with children, the relief payments that went to anyone who made less than $70,000 a year in the U.S. I believed, quite frankly, that once all that sort of dissipated and all that income support went away, that you would see people rejoin the labor market in droves at the end of 2021. And that development really didn't happen until January of 2022. So just last week, we got an employment report for the U.S. economy, and it showed that in January, the U.S. economy gained 479,000 new jobs in a single month. Now, if you dig a little deeper into that employment report, what you will see is that the big recovery in jobs came in the retail sector, of all things. And so retail employment in the U.S. is now back level to where it was prior to the pandemic. Now, again, I think this goes a long way towards relieving some of the goods inflation that we've seen over the last few years, because now we are seeing people return to regular shopping habits, going back to more in-person activities. And I believe this will take some of the pressure off of the scarcest good markets that were coming because people were spending more on goods than they were on services. I think that's part of the return to normalization that I expect to see this year. But one of the unusual reasons why retail employment recovered in January of all months is because, unlike pre-pandemic times when people would hire up for Christmas and then lay people off in January, we didn't see that development this year. So labor markets, I believe, are returning to normal as people re-enter the labor force. Labor force participation rates are slowly coming back to where they were before. But even in the midst of all that, there are still over 2 million fewer people employed in the U.S. today than there were prior to the pandemic. And I believe something more long-term is going on that you need to be aware of. The pandemic revealed to us some labor market dynamics that had been in place even prior to the pandemic, but had been a little papered over and distorted by what happened during the Great Recession. So if you think back to 2007, 2008, 2009, back then there was an enormous recession. Many people were laid off from their jobs, and the recovery in employment was very, very slow. So over the course of that economic recovery, it gave the impression to employers throughout the United States that labor supply was very, very loose and that talent was abundant. You get to the pandemic and something very unusual happened. In a very short period of time, in March, April, and May of 2020, people's connections to their jobs, to their employer, and to their geography was severed in a very short period of time. Now, this is not typically how things work in a recession. In a normal recession, the last thing to happen is people lose their jobs. So normally in a typical recession, you see that business is slowing down. You know that GDP is contracting. You typically, as a worker, know that your employer is struggling. And so you have some sense that it's possible you might lose your job. And so in a way, you can prepare for it, you plan for it, and it happens over a long period of time. What happened in the spring of 2020 was that, unlike a normal downturn, millions of Americans saw their connection to their job, their employer, and their geography severed in a really short period of time. So people, unlike normal, when they could prepare for it and could see it happening, this time around, it happened very, very quickly. So putting the pieces of that back together was going to take a really, really long time, because you severed people's connections, perhaps to industries or jobs that they may have only been marginally attached to anyway. And so once they were laid off, there's a possibility that they're never going to come back to them ever again. So that kind of disruption occurred against the backdrop of some larger demographic changes that I want to make you aware of. Because two things are sort of happening in markets. Baby boomers are retiring earlier, and there are fewer young people entering the labor force every single year. So I want to sort of talk to you first about what's going on with the current generation of retirees. And I've got a little sort of graphic here, a little graph that'll give you some sense of just how dramatic the changes are in the way that people are choosing to retire. Because we all knew that the baby boomers were going to retire, and you can see that in the red line on this chart. So baby boomers have been retiring for many, many years. And so this chart illustrates the percentage of the population that's actually retired. So it's extremely predictable. You probably know in your business, many years out, if you've got a stable sort of workforce, when people plan on retiring. So what's true of your business is also true of the general economy. We know every year from the percentage of people who reach a certain age, what percentage of those folks we expect to retire. So you can see that actual retirements versus the trend in baby boomer retirements pretty much tracked each other. Very, very predictable, very, very stable. So we all understood that the percentage of the population that was retired was increasing over time. We've been talking about the stresses on the Social Security system for many, many years. But the pandemic actually escalated retirements, I believe, for two reasons. What we know is that of the 4 million sort of missing jobs at the end of 2021, half of them were due to excessive retirements. Over 2 million additional retirements above and beyond what you would expect. Now, we don't exactly know why people are retiring early during the pandemic, but I have two reasons why I think it could sort of go a long way towards explaining things. One has to do with the fact that the changes to the way that we live, the way that we work, and the way that we are playing, all of the sort of virtualness and remoteness of the way that the world works now because of the pandemic, much of that is here to stay. That workers value flexibility in their schedules. They value having the ability to work remotely, at least for part of the week or part of the month. And given how the balance of power has shifted between employers and employees due to the pandemic, particularly in areas where remote work is possible, we're probably never going back to 100% of the time in the office world ever for many, many jobs. And there's quite a bit of skill that has to be developed in order to do this properly. And so if I'm someone who's thinking to myself, well, I was going to retire next year anyway, why would I go to the trouble of making the investment in the virtual world? Because it is a bit of an investment to sort of learn how to communicate with folks, make it feel like you're really there in person. There are the cultural aspects of or remote workforce that employers, like many of you, are probably struggling with. How do I maintain culture when so much of what we're doing now isn't face to face? Those are big challenges, and it's costly. And so if I'm a retiree and I was on the verge of retiring anyway, and I'm not really wild about all this technology stuff, you see a lot of folks just go ahead and say, you know what, I'm going to hang it up. And the second reason that they might do that is because the value of their homes and the value of their stock portfolios went up unexpectedly last year by about 20%. So if you're a retiree on the verge of retirement and you're now 20% wealthier than you were prior to the pandemic, then it's no surprise that you might say, you know what? I'd rather fish in Florida than put up with this Michigan winter. So suddenly you have an escalation of retirements, and it's not clear that those folks will ever rejoin the workforce. So at least 2 million additional retirements last year on that end of the labor force. Now, let's talk about what's going on with younger people, because the demographic squeeze on labor markets isn't just happening with the retirement of baby boomers. So if you go back to 2007, 2008, when that big millennial generation was hitting the labor market, they were all graduating from college and graduating from high school into the worst recession that we have seen since the Great Depression. So they graduate into these labor markets. There's, 1 million of them basically coming into the labor market, it's about 2.4 million of them coming into labor markets every single year. So employers, again, who were hiring folks at the time, got this misperception that there were plenty of young people out there if you needed young people in your workforce. Unemployment rates were high. And so many of those young people graduated from college or maybe graduated from law school even, couldn't find jobs in the profession that they had been trained for. Many of them entered the hospitality industry. If I can't get a job doing what I wanted to do, I'll just go bartend for a little while or work in a restaurant, work in a hotel. So they did that throughout their 20s. Then they find themselves in the midst of the pandemic being laid off from many of those jobs and looking around and going, well, I was going to age out of this eventually anyway, so I'm going to go do something else. One of the reasons why I believe the hospitality industry has struggled so greatly with a return to normal is that all of those millennials that they were employing prior to the pandemic, which would have aged out of those industries anyway, just escalated their movement into something else. On top of all that, every single year, the number of 18-year-olds entering the labor market, which is sort of what I would consider to be eligible to be employed, right? So we don't consider teenagers. Let's just talk about the number of 18-year-olds, because that's really your new labor force. Some of them go to college, but some of them go directly into work. The number of new 18-year-olds every single year is currently 300,000 fewer than what it was 10 years ago. So I know that's a little bit difficult to sort of follow, but basically what I'm telling you is the number of young people entering the labor force every single year is 300,000 less than what it was 10 years ago. So if you're out there and thinking, I'm trying to hire new people and they're just not there, I can't find them. The reason you can't find them is they literally 300,000 fewer of them exist today than did 10 years ago. And the troubling fact around that is that it doesn't get any better. There's no generation behind Gen Z that's bigger. In fact, our native-born population every single year gets smaller and smaller and smaller. And during the pandemic, it got even smaller. So remember how I said retirements were easy to predict? Well, births are really easy to predict too. And one of the things that we know is that during 2020, there were about 300,000 fewer babies born than what you would expect. So if you're having trouble attracting young talent right now, the sad news is that 18 years from now, it's going to be even worse because the population squeeze that we are experiencing in the US, while it's not as bad as the population squeeze in China, we are not to the point yet in the US where we have more deaths than births, but certainly Japan is there already. China is headed that direction. And it will be a challenge for the U.S. as well, as we simply have fewer and fewer native-born workers to move in and take the place of all of those retirees. I believe that the slowdown in 2007, 2008, and 2009 and the peculiar nature of that cyclical recession kind of covered this problem up in some ways, but the pandemic revealed it to us, and now businesses are struggling to catch up. Now, as a business, what do you do to catch up? Well, I actually believe that technology solves many of these problems. And so one of the challenges for businesses is how quickly can you adopt labor saving and labor augmenting? Because you don't just have to replace labor, but you do have to make the labor that you've got perform better and be more productive than it was before. So when I look out into the next 10 years, if I sort of say, hey, where do I think the big developments in the global economy are going to be over the next decade, I believe it is going to be an acceleration of automation, an acceleration of adoption of artificial intelligence, an acceleration of everything possible to augment and substitute for the labor supply that simply is not big enough at this point to produce all the goods and services that rich nations like the US and Japan and Europe demand. So I've covered inflation, I've covered employment, which gets us to the Federal Reserve. Because against the backdrop of a 7% inflation rate, an unemployment rate that is 4%, right? So you have 7% inflation, 4% unemployment. We're living in a world where the Federal Reserve is now certain to move to begin to normalize monetary policy in the months ahead. So most folks, myself included, expect the Federal Reserve at their next meeting in March to raise the Fed funds target rate at least 25 basis points. I am not in the camp of expecting a 0.5% increase. That would be a really dramatic change. They are signaling a 25 basis point increase, a move to normalization. And you will probably see if inflation remains high and labor markets remain tight, you'll see the Federal Reserve move 25 basis points every 6 weeks, probably for the remainder of the year, which will get monetary policy back to something that looks more like pre-pandemic levels. And for those of you out there who are thinking to yourself, well, what effect does that have on the stock market? What effect does that have on the bond market? What effect does that have on treasury or on housing markets? Well, I believe that we were already in the early stages of those effects. Everyone is expecting the Federal Reserve to move. You have already seen the Bank of England raise rates. You are seeing the European Central Bank, who didn't raise rates last week, just signal, though, that they will be moving to tighten monetary policy in the months ahead. So there's been a sort of global acceptance of tighter monetary policy. You are also going to see much tighter fiscal policy in the year 2022. So if you think about the trillions of dollars of relief money in 2020, additional stimulus money in early 2021, the year 2022 is going to see government spending move back to something much more normal, where deficits in the U.S. will go back to being about 5% of GDP instead of in the double digits like we saw over the last 2 years. So much more normal monetary policy, much more normal fiscal policy. And the question is, what effect will that have on markets in general? Well, I actually believe that you're going to see the biggest effects on whatever were the most speculative investments over the last 2 years. Because typically when the Federal Reserve moves to raise interest rates, it tends to sort of suck the energy in the air out of speculative investments. So let's think to ourselves, what might have been the most speculative investments over the last 2 years? Well, I'm thinking about things like cryptocurrency. I'm thinking about things like NFTs. I'm thinking about things like meme stocks. I'm thinking about things like special purpose acquisition companies. I'm thinking about things that I would almost all lump together and think of as abstract investments. Unlike airlines, which actually fly airplanes and move people around, that's not abstract. Even something like Facebook, Apple, while much of what they do is virtual, they actually sell advertising, right? Facebook sells advertising, and Apple produces handsets and computers, or at least designs handsets and computers. And so while these have abstract elements to them, I actually think that the investments that are going to struggle as the Federal Reserve moves to raise rates and the cost of capital increases are going to be the most abstract investments in the economy. Now, That doesn't mean that I don't believe that cryptocurrencies and blockchain technology in particular, I actually believe they have an important role to play in the economy moving forward. But I believe they will go through a period of adjustment, much like the dot-com boom of the late 1990s and early 2000s, a period of time when the Federal Reserve was raising rates and pulling liquidity out of the market that they had put into the market following the Asia crisis of the late 1990s. So that was a period of time where suddenly really loose financial conditions became very tight in a fairly short period of time. And you saw this dot-com boom of the late 90s turn into a dot-com bust. Now, that didn't mean that companies like Cisco, companies like Amazon, companies like Apple, which are now very big, important companies, they suffered through that boom and bust. And they are still with us today, much like I believe many of these abstract investments, the particular ones and the very ideas. NFTs are here to stay. Special purpose acquisition companies, they are here to stay. But I believe they're going through an adjustment period, and they will be the sector of the economy that is most affected by the Federal Reserve's moves to normalize monetary policy. Unlike real estate, which is where I'll sort of finish up before we move to seeing what's on your mind, talking about a little question and answer out there. In terms of real estate, I know a lot of folks are concerned once the Federal Reserve starts raising rates. What does that mean for real estate markets? Do we see a return to 2008, 2009, 2010? Do we see a bust in real estate? And I don't believe so for the following reason. As I said before, it's typically the most speculative sectors of markets that suffer when rates go up. And this time around, housing prices have increased and demand has been strong, not because people are flipping houses, not because people are buying homes simply because they think the price can only go up. People are buying homes because, as I said before, the way that we live, work, and play has permanently changed. So people need more space to accommodate work from home, the possibility of having to school their children from home on a short-term basis, all of these things that sort of changed during the pandemic that folks are expecting to continue at least for the foreseeable future. On top of that, you have all those millennials who are hitting their 30s and becoming first-time home buyers. So there's a tremendous amount of real demand from that demographic to move into their first starter homes. And home building never recovered from the 2008, 2009 financial crisis. So there was a boom in home building, but that was really temporary, and home building has never recovered. So the shortage of homes, the real shortage, this is not abstract, this is very real. There simply aren't enough homes built in the United States right now to satisfy the demand. If real estate was in a speculative sort of fever right now, you'd see a lot of leverage. And we simply don't see leverage out there the way we did in the bust period of 08, 09. Instead, so much of the activity is people paying cash for these homes, which exacerbates and makes it even harder for young folks who will need leverage to get into the housing market, to get on that first rung of the housing market. So the housing issues are very, very real. They are not speculative, and I don't expect rising interest rates to have a big effect on home prices. They may introduce a little bit of sanity as mortgages become a little bit more expensive. They may introduce some sanity into some markets that are, I suspect, particularly for those of you who are in the western half of the United States, sometimes you just shake your head and go, I can't believe that house sold for that price. I do think that rising interest rates will bring a little sanity to markets, but I don't expect the big decline in prices on the back of the big increase that we saw over the last 2 years. I don't think that materializes as the Federal Reserve moves to normalize. So when I think about the year 2022, sort of what we're looking at over the next few months, I expect that inflation, if it hasn't already peaked, will peak over the next couple of months. So you'll see your peak inflation numbers over the winter of 2022. I think that the labor supply issues and the talent scarcity that many of you are dealing with in your own businesses, unfortunately, that is a problem that is here to stay. And so in terms of how do you deal with it, you're going to have to make investments in labor saving, labor augmenting technologies. That's really the only solution to the scarcity of labor, because it's really difficult to, make new people. And then and you may be thinking, well, what about immigration? Well, I don't believe that the U.S. appetite for immigration does not seem to have increased enough, that the problem doesn't hurt people enough for us to be willing to have a really sensible discussion about what do we do about legal immigration into the U.S. So I don't expect politically that that's going to be solved anytime soon. So that's why I say technology is really the only way to deal with it. And so against the backdrop of high inflation, low unemployment, you get a Federal Reserve that moves to normalize things. That doesn't mean interest rates go up. I don't think we'll see 2-3%, which I would say is probably a normal Fed funds target rate. I don't think you'll get there at least for 2 years. The Federal Reserve will move slowly. They will move deliberately. They will communicate to markets exactly what they plan on doing as they move to raise rates in concert with beginning to normalize their balance sheet and their holdings of treasuries and mortgage-backed securities. But what do I expect to happen to markets in the wake of all of that? I think the most abstract investments will be hit the hardest, but that the housing market, because of the fundamentals there, will remain very strong over the next 12 months and into the next year. And the bulk of that, it comes from the strong demographic push from those millennial first-time buyers. So that sort of gives you a sense of where I think the world is, where I think the world is headed. And now I'd just be delighted to entertain questions on anything that I didn't cover that you might be curious about.
Wow. Thank you, Marci. That was just incredible. My brain is swimming with all the data that you just provided for us. Just like last year, I think we have so much to think about, and Patty, you as well. I hope all of you found this to be as intriguing as we did, and we've gotten so many questions from people today. There's no way we can get to all of them, but we will keep a list of them all and try to get back to you in some kind of an email format. So again, both of you are just awesome. Thank you so very much. One question we want to start with, Marci, with you. I think you scared the heck out of all of us on this labor supply question. And many of us in business are doing our best to retain and recruit new people, and we're having to really raise wages. How would you advise somebody to deal with that challenge until we can find the technology solutions that you were referencing at the end of your prepared remarks?
Well, even if you do have a technological solution, I expect there to be upward pressure on wages really for the next few years. It's not a short-term phenomenon, it's a long-term phenomenon, and it comes following about a 10-year period, well, really more like a 30-year period, where the balance of power between employers and employees has really been tilted toward the employer. And again, that financial crisis of 2008 and 2009 made it appear as if labor was far more in surplus than it really was. So I think we're going to have to accept the reality of this and not think that you're sort of good, that this is going to be temporary and you're going to go back to something else. It's going to squeeze profit margins. It's going to mean higher prices in the long run for consumers. But keep in mind that the positive side of all this is that while individual businesses may struggle with it, from a social point of view, one of the real pressures in our society over the last few years has been this notion of widening income inequality. If you see wages go up, particularly on the low end of the scale, on the low end of wages, for younger people in particular, I think that will go a long way towards repairing some of this sort of social unrest that we've seen as a result of the perception that the economy is not fair, you can't get ahead, all those things that have been kind of brewing underneath. Rising wages do go some way towards ameliorating some of that. So it's not unequivocally bad. It's just a different kind of challenge than what people have experienced over the last decade or so.
That's a really helpful answer, and I think for all of us in business, understanding that it is going to have an impact on our margins, but maybe the societal benefits of really creating a closer or eliminating the gap of wages, I think, is a great balance. So thank you for that. Another question targeted to you. You mentioned you think that deficit spending will start to decrease in the years ahead, but we've seen massive deficit spending these last 2 or 3 years. What impact is that going to have on inflation? And is there a come to Jesus moment somewhere in this relative to our past deficit spending?
Well, the only come to Jesus moment happens when interest rates go up dramatically. And so if you think about the last time that markets really sort of punished the United States for running large deficits, it was back in the late 1990s. And at that point, the yield on the 30-year Treasury began to bounce up around 7%. And it was at that point that the U.S. government got really serious about shifting from deficit spending to surplus spending. So it's really all in the hands of those long-term interest rates. And I actually am of the belief that it is completely possible for the U.S. government to, number one, balance their budget during normal times. So the pandemic was not a normal time. So we have to sort of set that aside. But as you move to an economy that looks much more normal, it's much stronger, like what we're experiencing right now and what I expect to happen next year, what you will find is that it's possible to do it if there was the political will to do it. But that political will, I don't expect to materialize until interest rates begin to bump up on the long end, probably somewhere around 5%. And it's at that point where the debt service on our previously accrued deficits will begin to take a significant bite out of the government's budget. But as of right now, as long as the world is willing to loan us money for free, there's really no political incentive to not run large deficits. So it's all in the hands of markets, quite frankly, and markets still seem to believe that the United States is still a good bet in terms of its ability to pay off its debts, even in the face of something like what happened last year, where short-term deficits bumped up dramatically. They obviously are going to come back down because you're not seeing the same level of emergency spending this year, and I don't expect that to happen next year or the next year or the next year.
Great. Well, that's hopefully reassuring, right? We've had a number of questions about the housing market. You both spoke about the housing market. Patty, let me turn to you. You talked about maybe slowing population growth. We have maybe rising interest rates, but everybody's so concerned about this supply-demand imbalance. What, if anything, can really change that? And what advice would you give to people about, do you buy a home? Do you sell a home? It's just a question we're getting all the time.
Well, it really is a whole supply-demand issue, and quite frankly, the demand for homes in our area, we don't expect to see that backing off anytime soon. You know, when you take a look at Colorado's population, the single peak year of age in our state right now is 29 years. So they're just starting to bump up against that whole first-time home buyer position, which they put around, an age of 34 years. So demand is not really backing off. I mean, yes, when interest rates increase, those mortgage rates increase, maybe we'll see a bit of a pullback in demand. So it really needs to come through the supply equation. We're building, again, 60,000 building permits that were issued in Colorado in 2021, probably about the same number or a little bit less than that in 2022. So it really becomes an issue of supply, making sure we have the right type of homes for people. I think there's a lot of mismatch happening right now in terms of the style of homes that people are really needing given our demographics. So it's that supply that really has to start shaking loose, that we need to start adding. And that's a challenge in Colorado.
Well, and especially made worse by the fact that we had 1,000 homes incinerated, and it just exacerbates the problem. Marci, would you add any comments to the housing question?
Well, actually, I think the point about supply is so important. And I know a lot of times, particularly at a local level, people can get really bogged down in the notion of we need more affordable housing as opposed to other types of housing. And my response as an economist is, I don't care what kind of housing it is, build as much as you can, because adding supply anywhere on the ladder makes homes up and down the ladder more affordable. So I'm of the camp that I think you can get sort of lost in the issue of affordability. Build as many houses as you can in the U.S. I don't care what level it is, because that will make houses more affordable all the way across the board.
Great. Both reassuring comments, I think. Patty, in your comments, you talked about the decline of entrepreneurship in Colorado. That's concerning for us because we're a small business entrepreneurial economy. Can you provide some incremental insights into that? What's causing that, and what can be done to ameliorate that?
So again, going back to the index, there were two components in particular that were troubling. One was what they called the opportunity share. So that again are the number of entrepreneurs, those number of innovators out there that are starting their businesses because they want to. And I think that during the pandemic, getting that mentoring assistance, yes, you've got all your virtual methods, but actually being able to sit down with somebody and getting some of that counseling, that mentoring assistance has perhaps been a little bit challenging. So those people that have that big idea may not have the resources that they need to move it forward. The other thing was that the startup survival rate, and a lot of this goes to financing. A lot of companies, they come out with the big idea, they've got their nest egg that they're ready to invest, but then they need those financing resources to keep it going, and that's where banks such as Vectra Bank can really assist in trying to keep those entrepreneurs going so that they can get past that initial hump and really be able to not just grow their business, but to thrive as well.
Another question came in sort of tangential to this, and that is, there's a similar challenge with minority and women and veteran-owned businesses in this country and their ability to access capital. And I think all of us as banks have to be committed to doing exactly what you just suggested and making sure that we're providing education, we're providing access to that capital, we're working more clearly about how can we support that section of the economy as well. Because as Marci said, we have this wage and income disparity question, and I think as we can invest in these entrepreneurial companies and minority-owned businesses, that's a big challenge, I think, for our country. Marci, any comments on any of that entrepreneurship and minority-owned business line?
Well, this has become, such a hot topic over the last 5 or 6 years. And from a broad economist point of view, what I like to really point out is that the focus on putting to full use some of the most underutilized resources, most underutilized talent in the economy simply makes the U.S. economy more productive. I liken it to something like Uber or Airbnb, where what Uber and Airbnb did is that they take resources that normally aren't utilized and use them to their fullest capacity. They take idle resources and maximize them. And our any kind of development, any kind of push into utilizing talent that has previously been underutilized because of either systemic or just systemic discrimination or even unintentional bias, all of those things are, when I look out into the future, simply make the U.S. economy more productive at a local level, but also at a national level as well.
So we are past our time, and I hate to stop all these questions because we have so many other good ones coming in, but we will try to get answers to people. I just want to thank Marci and Patty so much for the quality of your presentations this year. So thought-provoking, and I think hopefully inspiring for all our customers and guests that are online today. I think it's this kind of information that provides a platform for all of us to anticipate what comes ahead. How do we navigate the economy of the future? And I think you've both given us great tools to be able to do that for 2022 and beyond. So thank you very much. And with that, we are adjourned.